Hi, so welcome back to part 2 for measurement. We're going to focus largely on evaluating the measure. So the first way you want to think about a measure, it's validity. How well the measure represents the true construct of interest, the thing we're trying to measure. How good a job are we doing? So go back to the last video when I asked you to think about something in your own job or the field you work in that's important to measure, and think about how you conceptualize that measure. And now think about the practical measures, the ones that they actually use to evaluate that construct, that thing you want to know about. Pause for a second. Think about how valid you think that measure is. Maybe you want to think about one of your own performance measures on a job. How well you are doing your job and how well you think the evaluation, your evaluation, caught what it should measure. So a big example we use in the book is the U.S. poverty measure, and this is actually something I've done a lot of research on. So many people think that the official U.S. poverty measure has validity problems. What does that mean? Well, it's partially related to that bias we talked about last time, that the measure of income doesn't include in-kind benefits, SNAP or food stamps as it's more commonly called, housing vouchers. And what about Medicaid or Medicare or even employer health insurance? Does that help you meet your needs? What are your needs? What do you need to be able to afford to not be poor as you personally conceptualize poor, as you think other people conceptualize poor? That's all about the extent to which the U.S. poverty measure, another one, is valid or invalid. So just take a few seconds, pause, write down what you think. Okay, thanks. So to what extent do you think the U.S. poverty measure is valid or invalid? Now I want to ask you a question that's close to my heart because of research I do. Do you think healthcare is a basic need? Or some healthcare? And if so, how much healthcare do you need? You're like, well, it depends. Are you sick? Do you have an injury? Are you healthy? Boy, how many dollars do you need of health care? How much should we put in the threshold? Tough problem, huh? So that's one I worked on. My colleague Sanders Korman and I developed what we call a health inclusive poverty measure. We treat health insurance as a need because it was just impractical to make health care a need. But maybe not everyone agrees that health insurance is a need. And then we measure things like Medicaid and Medicare and employer health insurance, subsidies for the Affordable Care Act marketplace as resources. Okay, plug for my research is over. There's a really short video on YouTube. Last plug, I promise. Now let's talk about face validity, because it turns out validity is kind of hard to measure. And the first way people do it is just kind of look at their common sense. Just looking at, on the face of it, how well does the measure get at what we want to measure? Some measures work by asking people to report what they did through self-reporting, like exit polls in the election. Others use other indicators. The polygraph, the quote-unquote lie detector, looks at physical signs of stress, blood pressure, sweating, heart rate, stuff like that. Do you think that has face validity? Is having a high heart rate and sweating, does that mean you're lying? Well, not exactly. Some people do those things when they're not lying, and some people are lying and they don't have the signs of stress. But on the other hand, on average, it might be a pretty good indicator. So when you have that conversation, you're talking about the face validity of polygraph test as measuring whether someone tells a lie. There are a lot of different types of validity. There's a lot of jargon, and we won't expect you in this class to know all the jargon, but there are some really important ideas. So one is something that is sometimes called content validity, although not always. Sometimes that term is used in other ways. And one of the things, does it have all the important dimensions? If we want to figure out if someone is healthy and we only measure their pain, we're missing important dimensions of what it means to be healthy. Think about how some people see standardized tests, which are multiple choice, that are supposed to measure learning. Is there criticism partially that, hey, there are really important dimensions of learning, like how to write a good essay, that those tests miss? Another feature that's related is whether it captures the full range of variation in the construct. So in measuring pain, you want to differentiate no pain and some pain. Moreover, relevant dimensions and the full range and lots of other aspects of measure can vary by context. You know, if we're looking at whether something reduces pain for people who are in chronic pain, the relevant full range may be different than if we're talking about a relatively healthy population. So validity isn't, oh, it's valid, it's not valid. It has to be assessed for the purpose the measure is used. So be a bit skeptical, like, oh, we have this instrument and it's been validated, it's a great measure of X. May be a great measure of X in one context, but not in your context. So think about how you're going to use that measure. So far we've talked about general ideas about how to look at validity. Now we're going to do the jargon is criterion-related validity, and you don't need that jargon. It just means an empirical method. We're going to not kind of look at it and say, does it make sense, and think about it qualitatively. We're going to have some explicit strategy, almost always a quantitative strategy, for assessing validity. And there are just lots and lots of these. There's what's called concurrent validity. So if you have some other measure of what you want to know, how well does this new one agree? So an example would be self-reported measure of drug use, such as illegal drug use, and a physical test for that drug. How well does self-reported drug use match physical test? Spoiler alert, self-reported illegal drug use is substantially underreported. It's biased downward. The measure is too low. Very closely related is predictive validity. You basically look at how well your measure predicts consequences in the future that you would expect it. So how well does job satisfaction predict the extent to which people quit 1 year later? Shouldn't be perfect. There are lots of reasons people quit or don't quit, but all else equal, we'd expect more job satisfaction, less quitting. So there are a lot of limitations to these empirical validity studies. It's not all or nothing. There's more of a continuum. There may be no clear criterion with which to judge it. And as we said, a measure can be valid for one purpose and not for another. It can often be quite subjective. A related idea is this idea of measurement error, but there are two big kinds of errors. One is the one that we talked about with the poverty measure so far, bias. Systematic directional error, too big, too low. So if you want to know your weight and you're wearing shoes and clothes, that's an upward bias. The weight the scale is going to measure is higher than your true weight because of the shoes. Bias is a really, really big theme in this course. Bias can come from measurement, but we'll see there's a lot of sources of bias. In the next chapter, we'll talk about it from the sample, from the subjects or cases you use to get many measurements. We're also going to talk about in the second half of the course when we look about causal effects, the effect of one thing on another. Bias means it's all your errors, or on average rather, your errors are in one direction, is a big concern. There's another kind of error, which is random error or noise. These are non-systematic errors. If you've got enough of them, they cancel out. So the example from the book is this sticky needle on the scale. Half the time it sticks too high, half the time it sticks too low. But that's a random error. And those are better because if you get enough data, they will average out to 0. Closely related to the idea of noise is this idea of a reliability of a measure. How consistent is it when applied to the same object or event? How large is that random error? So what kinds of things could cause noise in the U.S. poverty measure? Data entry errors. Smaller and smaller in these days, but if you're asking someone verbally about their income and you misenter it, equally likely to get the digits wrong in one direction or another. So again, bias is an aspect of validity. Are you measuring what you want to measure? It's not considered part of reliability. So I've kind of been dissing reliability. Yeah, it's not that important, but it still matters. So the good part about noise, is if you have a large enough sample, it'll average out. So here's a showing that, here's if you get, this is your confidence interval, one measure of error, say, more data averages to 0. But there are other problems. First of all, estimating relationships. Here, if you're measuring like an independent variable in X, like you did, the kind of regression you did in stats, with very few errors, you get this nice accurate slope. But the more noise you have, the harder it is to see the relationship. Think about any relationship you're interested in, like the relationship between education and earnings. The more noise there is in education, the more likely education is mismeasured, the harder it is to see that relationship. There are two reasons even more important for practitioners that reliability matters. One is classifying individuals. So think about that poverty status. Think about determining a family's eligibility for welfare benefits. If that family's poverty status is mismeasured, perhaps because their income is mismeasured, for random reasons, we'll get it wrong. It might average out for some great stats, but for that family, oh boy, that's pretty bad. Same about students graduating, being promoted to the next grade. It's pretty high stakes for them, so random errors matter a lot. That's one of the reasons psychometrics, the field of psychology focused on especially testing and other different ways of measuring things, is often very concerned about reliability to avoid these kinds of errors when they're high stakes for individuals. But it obviously matters in lots of practice and policy settings. Another one is tracking changes over time. This is the most understudied thing in measurement that's really important. How many organizations are judged by improvement over time? Our school's test scores went up. Oh, they went down. Our nursing home, falls and other performance measures, they got worse. Is your organization judged by changes over time? Many are. Then it becomes really important. How consistent is the measure over time? Is it measuring the same thing? There's jargon for that, parallel forms reliability, but that one is really important. So the consistency of the measure over time is really important for practical things. So there are a number of different reliability assessment strategies. Some are basically related to doing it twice. Do it once, do it again. That's a great thing, a great approach called test-retest reliability, but only if you don't expect what you're measuring to change over time. So we could give students that's a good approach to seeing how reliable it is, but often you give students a test over time because you expect something to have changed, because it would have changed. Then it's not reliability, it's being used to look at change over time. Another thing is inter-rater reliability. Just get two research workers to do the same thing and see how much they agree. That is widely used, and that's also widely used in coding qualitative research. Seeing how consistent the codes are for two. I talked about parallel forms reliability, looking at the consistency over time. If school systems change their tests, are results comparable? Or if they change their procedures? Remember that example from Chapter 1 when they were giving out practice questions and they were also keeping the questions on the test very similar. So similar, students learn to get them right without even understanding the math. So that consistency is important. Finally, there's a somewhat different type of reliability related to scale. Remember when you're using a whole bunch of different questions to try and look at a scale. And the issue is how consistent are those questions or items making up the scale. Call that internal reliability, right? So you've got a bunch of questions or items, how consistent are they with each other? This is a widely used diagram to show about validity and reliability combinations. So this one in the upper right is something where it's valid, meaning that on average you're getting the right answer, but they're way spread out. It's unreliable because it's way off target, but on average, it's on target. This is the polar opposite in the lower left. It's reliable. Look how clustered everything is, very consistent, but it's not valid. It's way off target. So here is what you want in the lower right. It's on target, it's valid, and it's consistent. It's clustered. And then the worst possible case is in the upper left. Unreliable and not valid. Spread out and off target. Oh my God, that's a pretty useless measure. So let's talk about some practical concerns about measurement in the real world. The first is there's often a tension between cost and quality. You often have to settle for something that's less valid because it's less costly and it's all that's affordable. That's just the reality. But as I said at the earlier in the prior video, it's important to recognize the way that a measure is less valid than you like. Then you won't be misled by it. You won't, drink the Kool-Aid, as one student once said to me. There's also ethical things. Is there a burden on the respondents? And how will that burden affect the quality and rate of responding? So when you're doing surveys, what is it reasonable to ask of people? There's also often a validity-reliability trade-off, and this is one of my favorite points to make. A lot of time in testing, because it's high stakes and everyone wants to be fair, there's a big focus on reliability, and the psychometricians have gotten pretty good about that. But that's often at the cost of validity. So here I am, it's my favorite point because I think that my own tests, like the final exam you'll have at the end of class, and like the practice problems I give along the way, they emphasize validity. The idea is, hey, you guys are practitioners, or some of you will be analysts, and you're doing applied things, and what I want to see is how well you can use research out in the real world. So I'm going to ask these very applied questions in specific contexts, some education or healthcare or housing. So based on what you do professionally or your background or your interests or what you just happened by chance to have read about, you may know more about one context than another. You may have thought about it. That may help you some if you really thought about or know about something. That'll make it less reliable because there's this noise. The random chance of you versus somebody else happening to know more or less about this topic undermines reliability, increases noise, but it's at the cost of validity. I could instead ask like questions about you memorizing certain definitions. That would be reliable. I gave the same definition, it's consistent, there's not noise, it's not very valid. It won't be very useful for your career to have memorized a bunch of definitions. You see that trade-off in validity and reliability in lots and lots of contexts. Think about measuring activities of daily living from in a population in a nursing home. Think about all kinds of real-world things. Again, go back to your example of what you wanted to measure, how you conceptualized it. Think about different possible real-world measures. Think about their validity, their reliability. And for a given cost, do you have to trade them off? So pause, seriously think about that. These are high-stakes, important things, very important to practitioners. There's also a lot of practical issues related to established versus new measures. Established measures are great. Consistency over time. Remember, I was just emphasizing that. But sometimes a measure becomes less and less relevant. Think of, a measure of bullying, something we're going to talk about in practice problems. What if bullying asked questions that were all about in person and left out online bullying? It may not be so relevant. Measurement has become a high-stakes issue. Think about all your organizations that get sanctioned or rewarded based on these things. Government agencies and so on. To be accountable, that's a good thing. But then it can result on gaming. Often talk about the excellent TV series from quite a few years ago called The Wire. Several different years look at this high stakes measurement issue and how it can cause some gaming problems. Other issue, multiple measures, because you got lots of dimensions, right? Poverty isn't just one thing, there can be different things. Your relative poverty or your absolute poverty, as we talk about in the book. About healthcare coverage, or just the wholly material thing. But if you have so many measures, people stop paying attention. They can't take it in. So you might want to aggregate over these dimensions for reasons of attention and resources gathering them. So now I already asked you to do this, to think about the tension between validity and reliability, think about them in standardized educational tests, think about them in the context of self-reported health, and your suggestions. Do you have a measure you can think of? How could you make it valid? Would that affect its reliability? Would that affect its cost? Hi, that's it for part 2 of measurement. One thing I really want to emphasize is the generality of these ideas, and in particular their importance often neglected in analytics and data analytics. Everyone treats the idea that the data speaks for itself, that it's measured what people says it measures, that you don't need to think about what you really want to know, how you want to use it, and that compares to how it was gathered. So measurement is not the only piece of social science research methods that I think is very important for and neglected in analytics as it's increasingly used, but I think it's a particularly neglected one. Okay, thanks. See you later.